I was standing in a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. when my Uncle Charles pointed straight at me and said, "That woman stole $60 million from a dying old man." The room went silent. Reporters lowered their pens. One woman in the back actually gasped. Even the judge leaned back in his chair like he was preparing for a long afternoon. I remember smoothing my hands over my dark blue marine dress uniform just to keep myself steady. My heartbeat felt loud enough to shake the room. Charles Wilson stood there in a tailored gray suit that probably cost more than my first car. His silver hair was combed perfectly. His cufflinks flashed under the courtroom lights. To everyone watching on television, he looked like the respectable son of an American military dynasty. I looked like the scandal. Then Charles said something that changed everything. "She's not a Wilson," he snapped. "She never was." That was the moment I stopped being afraid of him. Because by then I already knew what his family had done to my father. And I knew exactly how badly they had underestimated me. 3 months earlier, I'd been stocking medical inventory at Camp Pendleton in Southern California, worrying about my mother's overdue pharmacy bill and whether my truck would survive another summer. My life was painfully ordinary back then. I was 32 years old, a Marine Corps logistics officer, divorced, tired all the time, and still paying off debts from helping care for my mother during her cancer treatments. Most evenings I drove home to my little rental duplex in Oceanside, microwaved leftovers, and fell asleep in front of old reruns on television. Nobody would have looked at me and seen a woman connected to one of the wealthiest military families in America. Frankly, I wouldn't have believed it either. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost ignored it because the number was international. "Captain Emily Carter?" the man asked. His voice sounded polished, educated, the kind of voice that belonged in expensive buildings. "Yes. My name is Walter Brenner. I'm calling from Keller and Vogel International Legal Services in Zurich, Switzerland." I actually laughed a little. "I think you've got the wrong number." "No, ma'am," he said calmly. "I'm looking for the granddaughter of General Arthur Wilson." That name hit me like cold water. Even ordinary Americans knew who Arthur Wilson was. Decorated combat commander, defense consultant, cable news military analyst, one of those men who spent 30 years appearing in patriotic documentaries while politicians shook his hand. My mother hated him. That's about all I knew. "Sir," I said carefully, "I think there's been some mistake." There was a pause on the line. Then he said the sentence that turned my whole life upside down. "Your grandfather, General Arthur Wilson, left you $60 million. I leaned against the supply cabinet, because suddenly my knees didn't feel reliable anymore. Around me, Marines kept moving boxes and clipboards like the world was normal, but mine wasn't. I almost laughed. "You have the wrong person." He replied calmly like he'd expected that reaction. "Fly to Zurich. Say your father's name. Do not ask questions." Then he hung up. Just like that. No explanation. No sales pitch. Nothing. I stared at the phone for almost a full minute. Then Staff Sergeant Lewis walked by carrying a crate. "You okay, ma'am?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just a weird phone call." That night I drove to see my mother. She lived in a small assisted living apartment outside San Diego. The place always smelled faintly like coffee and old paperbacks. She was sitting near the window knitting when I walked in. The moment I said the name Arthur Wilson, her hands froze. I noticed that immediately. "You never told me he was my grandfather." Her expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. "That family has nothing to do with us." "Mom, somebody from Switzerland called me." That got her attention. Real fear crossed her face. Not confusion. Fear. "What did they say?" I told her everything. By the time I finished, she looked pale. "You are not going to Zurich," she said firmly. "Why not?" "Because those people ruin lives." I sat down across from her. "All my life you told me my father abandoned us." She looked away. "That's what I believed was safest." Safest? Not true. Safest. I noticed my pulse quickening again. What does that mean? But she wouldn't answer. The conversation ended with both of us angry. I left around 9 o'clock and drove home through heavy coastal fog, feeling like my entire childhood had suddenly become unreliable. 2 days later, my half-brother Daniel showed up uninvited. Daniel came from my mother's second marriage. He owned luxury car dealerships in Arizona and wore expensive watches even to casual lunches. He walked into my duplex, looked around at my old furniture and said, "So, this is where America's newest millionaire lives." I crossed my arms. "Mom told you. She's terrified. She's hiding something." "Emily," he sighed, "you're chasing some fantasy because an old rich guy died." I handed him the business card Walter Brenner had emailed me. Daniel's expression changed slightly when he saw the firm's name. "That's real," he admitted quietly. "I checked too." Still he shook his head. "You can't seriously be thinking about going." "Why not?" "Because rich families like that don't suddenly hand money to strangers." "I'm not a stranger if he was my grandfather." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You really believe that?" That irritated me more than I expected. "You know what, Daniel? Some people don't spend their whole lives measuring worth by money. And some people," he shot back, "don't know when they're being manipulated." After he left, I sat awake most of the night staring at the old wooden box my mother kept hidden in her closet when I was little. Years ago, after she got sick, she'd finally given it to me. Inside were old photographs, military patches, yellowed newspaper clippings, and one torn picture of my mother standing beside a Marine officer whose face had been ripped away. I suddenly realized something terrifying. Maybe my mother hadn't destroyed that photograph because she hated him. Maybe she destroyed it because she was afraid somebody else would recognize him. 3 days later, I requested emergency leave from the Marines. The following Sunday, I boarded a flight to Switzerland carrying one duffel bag, my dress uniform, and more questions than answers. As the plane lifted over the California coast, I looked down at the fading shoreline and had the strange feeling that the woman leaving America wasn't the same woman who'd come back. The bank didn't look anything like I expected. After everything I'd imagined during the 11-hour flight to Switzerland, I thought I'd find giant marble columns, gold lettering, maybe even armed guards standing outside like something from an old movie. Instead, the building sat quietly beside a narrow street near Lake Zurich, tucked between luxury boutiques and a watchmaker's shop. No signs, no flags, just gray stone walls and dark windows polished so clean they reflected the cloudy morning sky. It looked less like a bank and more like a place where powerful people disappeared for private conversations. I stood outside holding my Marine duffel bag, exhausted from travel and running almost entirely on coffee and nerves. For a moment I nearly turned around. The whole thing still felt insane. $60 million? A grandfather I'd never met? Father nobody would explain? And one sentence repeating in my mind like a warning. Say your father's name. Do not ask questions. Inside, the lobby was silent except for soft piano music. Everything smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished wood. Men in tailored suits moved quietly between offices carrying folders instead of computers. A young receptionist greeted me with a polite smile. "May I help you?" I suddenly felt ridiculous standing there in wrinkled civilian clothes with jet lag and military posture. I'm here to meet Walter Brenner." She typed something into her computer. "I'm sorry, miss. There's no appointment under your name." Of course there wasn't. Swallowed hard. The receptionist gave me the kind smile people use on confused tourists. Then I remembered the instructions. My voice came out quieter than I intended. My father's name was Captain Jonathan Wilson. Everything changed instantly. The woman's expression froze. Not confusion, recognition. She stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward. "One moment, please." Within 30 seconds, 2 older men in dark suits appeared from a hallway. One of them approached me carefully, almost respectfully. "Miss Carter?" "Yes, please come with us." No more questions. No hesitation. They escorted me to a private elevator requiring a key card and fingerprint scan. That was the moment I realized this situation was far bigger than inheritance paperwork. As the elevator rose, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. 32-year-old Marine officer from Oceanside, California. Boots worn from base life. Hair pulled into a practical bun. Dark circles under my eyes. I did not belong in a place like this. The elevator opened onto an entire private floor overlooking Lake Zurich. That's where I finally met Walter Brenner. He was older than I expected. Mid-70s maybe. White hair, thin glasses. calm blue eyes that reminded me of doctors who already know the diagnosis before speaking. "Captain Emily Carter," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." I shook it carefully. "You really knew my grandfather?" "For over 40 years. He motioned toward a chair beside enormous windows overlooking the water. Coffee arrived almost immediately. Real coffee, not the burnt motor oil we drank on base. I sat there holding the cup while Walter opened a thick file folder. Then he studied me quietly for several seconds. "You resemble your father more than I expected." That sentence hit harder than the inheritance. Nobody had ever told me I resembled him before because nobody ever talked about him. "What really happened to him?" I asked. Walter folded his hands together. "Your mother told you he abandoned the family." "Yes." That was not true. The room suddenly felt smaller. I kept my face steady the way Marines are trained to do, but inside something was beginning to crack open. Walter continued carefully. "Captain Jonathan Wilson served in Marine intelligence during the 1990s. Officially, he died during a classified overseas operation." "Officially?" Walter looked toward the lake before answering. "General Wilson believed your father was betrayed." I stared at him. "By who?" He hesitated. "Possibly members of his own family." I actually laughed once under my breath, not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. But then again, 3 days earlier I believed my grandfather didn't even know I existed. Walter slid several photographs across the desk. The first showed a young Marine officer standing beside General Arthur Wilson. My breath caught immediately. The officer had my eyes, my jawline, even the same serious expression I saw every morning in the mirror. Jonathan Wilson. My father. For a long moment I couldn't speak. He looked so ordinary. Not a ghost, not a villain, just a Marine. I felt angry suddenly. Angry at my mother. Angry at the lies, angry at 32 years of missing answers. Walter gave me time before speaking again. "Your grandfather spent decades trying to uncover what truly happened. And shortly before his death he changed his will." "Why me?" Walter's expression softened. "Because you enlisted in the Marines." I blinked. "What?" "He followed your military career quietly for years. He believed you carried your father's integrity." I leaned back slowly, trying to process that. The old man had watched my life from a distance while I struggled through deployments, divorce, debt, and hospital visits with my mother. Part of me felt violated. Another part felt strangely seen. Walter cleared his throat. Opened another folder. General Wilson's children expected to inherit his estate equally. "Charles Wilson," I said quietly. Walter nodded once. "Your uncle was displeased." "That's one word for it." Walter almost smiled. Then his expression turned serious again. "There is another matter." Of course there was. He handed me a sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's signature. Before I opened it, Walter spoke carefully. "Your inheritance is protected under Swiss and American law. However, General Wilson attached personal conditions." I looked up. "What kind of conditions?" "He requested that you review certain family records before claiming the estate." "Why?" "Because he believed you deserved the truth." My fingers felt cold opening the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was firm but uneven from age. "Emily, if you are reading this, then I failed to fix what my family destroyed. You are the last honest Wilson left." I stopped reading. The room became painfully quiet. Last honest Wilson. I didn't even know these people. Walter slid another folder toward me. Inside were photographs, military records, financial documents, and newspaper clippings spanning almost 30 years. Then I saw my Uncle Charles's name again and again. Defense contracts, weapons manufacturing, political donations, missing reports. I looked up slowly. "What exactly did this family do?" Walter answered carefully. "Enough that your grandfather spent the final years of his life trying to make peace with God." That night, alone in a luxury hotel room overlooking Zurich, I sat awake until nearly dawn reading classified copies and faded letters. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I found something that made my hands shake. A letter from my father to my mother. It had never been opened, and suddenly I understood something terrible. My father hadn't abandoned us. Someone had made sure we never heard from him again. I barely slept after reading my father's letter. The hotel room overlooked Lake Zurich, calm and silver beneath the early morning fog. But my mind felt like a storm had settled inside it. Every piece of my childhood suddenly seemed unstable. For 32 years I'd believed my father walked away from us. Now I was staring at proof that somebody had erased him instead. Around 6 o'clock in the morning I made coffee using the tiny machine in the hotel room, and sat beside the window rereading the letter. Claire, if anything happens to me, promise me you'll keep Emily away from the Wilson family. There are things my father allowed that he can never undo. I love you both more than my own life. Jonathan. I read those lines at least 10 times. Not one sentence sounded like a man abandoning his family. It sounded like a man trying to protect them. By the time I arrived back at the bank later that morning, exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes. Walter Brenner noticed immediately. You've been reading all night. Yes, and I sat across from him slowly. My mother lied to me my entire life. Walter adjusted his glasses carefully. Your mother was frightened, Emily. That doesn't excuse it. No, he admitted quietly. It does not. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Outside, the massive windows trams rolled quietly through Zurich streets while businessmen hurried through cold morning drizzle. Everything looked peaceful out there. Inside me nothing was peaceful anymore. I opened the folder again. There are references here to defense contracts and missing reports, I said. What exactly was my father investigating? Walter hesitated long enough to make me nervous. Then he spoke carefully. In the early 1990s, Jonathan Wilson discovered evidence that military suppliers were overbilling the government through fraudulent overseas contracts. That happens all the time. Yes, Walter replied. But this involved senior officials and private defense companies with political connections. I stared at him. And my clear's throat family was involved? Members of your family profited from those contracts. The room suddenly felt colder. I'd spent my adult life serving in the Marines, believing honor mattered. Duty, integrity, sacrifice. Those words weren't decorations to me. Marines lose marriages, health, and years with family because we believe service means something. Now, I was learning my own bloodline might have used patriotism like a business strategy. I leaned back slowly. So my father threatened them? General Wilson believed Jonathan intended to testify. And then he disappeared. Yes. I rubbed my forehead. You keep saying General Wilson believed. Why not say knew? Walter's face tightened slightly. Because nobody was ever recovered. That sentence hung in the air between us. Nobody. I suddenly remembered all the years my mother refused to declare my father officially dead when paperwork required it. I thought grief had made her stubborn. Maybe she'd known something too. Walter handed me another file. These are private journals from General Wilson's final years. I opened one carefully. The handwriting was rougher than the letter I'd read overnight. I failed my son. That line sat alone on the page. Underneath it, I taught my children discipline but not morality. I closed the journal for a moment. An old man nearing death had written those words while sitting on top of one of the largest fortunes in America. Money really could not protect people from regret. Walter spoke softly. Your grandfather became a different man near the end of his life. What changed him? You. I frowned. What does that mean? He followed your military career privately. When you enlisted after college instead of pursuing corporate work, he became hopeful. That's ridiculous. He never even contacted me. He believed your mother would refuse. Honestly, she probably would have. Still, anger continued building inside me. My entire life had been shaped by decisions made in rooms I was never allowed into. Decisions by wealthy, powerful people who kept secrets while ordinary people paid the price. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing in my chest since yesterday. What happens if I refuse the inheritance? Walter looked genuinely surprised. You would walk away from $60 million? I'm asking. He folded his hands together. Then the estate would likely revert to Charles Wilson and other surviving family members. I thought about my uncle standing in some giant Virginia mansion polishing his reputation while my mother struggled to afford cancer medication. The anger inside me sharpened. No, I said quietly. That's not happening. For the first time since arriving in Zurich, Walter gave me a small approving nod. Good, I thought bitterly. Maybe there's a little Wilson in me after all. Later that afternoon, Walter arranged a secure video call with an American attorney representing the estate in Washington. That was the first time I heard my Uncle Charles's voice. "You should have stayed in California," he said coldly through the screen. No greeting, no introduction, just hostility. I sat straight in the leather conference chair. "And you should have told the truth 30 years ago." His expression darkened immediately. "You know absolutely nothing about this family." "I know my father wrote letters my mother never received." Charles exhaled slowly through his nose. "You think Jonathan was some hero?" "He was reckless. He was a Marine." "He was naive," Charles snapped. "He thought exposing corruption would somehow purify the world." I noticed Walter watching silently beside me. "Did you love him at all?" I asked. That question seemed to hit Charles harder than I expected. For a second he looked older, tired, then the mask returned. "If you challenge this family publicly," he said, "your life will become very unpleasant." I almost smiled. "I'm a Marine, Mr. Wilson. Unpleasant is usually before breakfast." Walter muted the call before Charles could answer. For a few seconds the room stayed silent. Then Walter actually chuckled under his breath. "Your grandfather would have enjoyed that." I surprised myself by smiling a little too. It disappeared quickly. Because underneath the tension another realization had begun settling into me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about humiliation. My mother spent decades struggling alone while these people lived in wealth and influence. My father died branded a traitor while others built fortunes. And now they wanted me quiet too. That evening Walter took me to a small restaurant overlooking the lake. Mostly older couples filled the dining room speaking softly over candlelight and wine. "You remind me of Jonathan," Walter said while cutting his steak. "Everyone keeps saying that. It's not only appearance." "What then?" "He also believed truth mattered more than comfort." I stared down at my plate. "That belief got him killed." Walter was quiet for several seconds. Then he answered carefully. "Yes, sometimes it does." Back in my hotel room later that night I stood at the window watching lights ripple across the dark water. For most of my life I thought revenge belonged to angry young men in movies. But standing there alone in Zurich holding evidence of what had been stolen from my father, I finally understood how revenge begins. Not with violence, not with rage, with grief. Deep enough grief eventually hardens into purpose. And for the first time in my life I wanted the Wilson family to hurt the way my mother had hurt for 30 years. When I landed back in the United States, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary everything looked. People rushed through airports carrying coffee cups and backpacks. Families argued near baggage claim. Television screens played weather reports nobody was listening to. Meanwhile, I was carrying enough family secrets to destroy one of America's most respected military dynasties. I rented a sedan at Reagan National Airport and drove south toward Virginia through cold autumn rain. Walter Brenner had warned me the memorial service for General Arthur Wilson would attract politicians, retired military officers, corporate executives, and media personalities. He wasn't exaggerating. The service was held at a private chapel outside Arlington. Black SUVs lined the road for nearly half a mile. Men with earpieces stood near the entrance pretending not to be security. As I parked, I suddenly became aware of my Marine dress uniform again. The dark blue coat, the medals, the polished shoes. For years that uniform made me feel grounded. Now it felt like armor. The moment I stepped from the car, conversations nearby began slowing down. People recognized the name on the news already. The forgotten granddaughter, the surprise heir, the scandal. An older Marine standing near the entrance nodded respectfully when he saw my uniform. "Morning, Captain." "Morning, sir." Inside the chapel smelled faintly of old wood and lilies. Large photographs of General Wilson stood near the altar showing him beside presidents, military leaders, and foreign dignitaries. America had loved this man. But judging by the tension in the room, his family had not. I spotted Charles Wilson almost immediately. He stood surrounded by attorneys and businessmen near the front pews. Expensive suit, silver hair, calm smile carefully designed for cameras. Then he saw me. His expression hardened instantly. A woman beside him whispered something urgently into his ear. Charles started walking toward me. The room gradually quieted as people noticed. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. I kept my voice calm. He was my grandfather. He was manipulated by opportunists at the end of his life. "That's," I replied. Walter Brenner described him as perfectly lucid. His jaw tightened. "You have no understanding of what you're walking into. I understand my father died while your family got richer." That landed harder than I expected. For just a second, Charles looked genuinely shaken. Then the anger returned. Jonathan destroyed himself. He was trying to expose corruption. Charles lowered his voice further. "You think the world rewards honesty? Grow up." I stared at him carefully. That sentence told me more about the Wilson family than any legal file ever could. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. "Charles." An older man stepped beside us wearing the uniform of a retired Marine colonel. Tall despite age, white hair cropped short, deep lines around sharp blue eyes. Charles immediately stepped back. "Colonel Harris," he said stiffly. The colonel ignored him completely and turned toward me. "You must be Emily." "Yes, sir." He shook my hand firmly. "I served with your father." Everything inside me froze. Charles muttered something under his breath and walked away without another word. Colonel Harris watched him leave. That family still thinks money can control consequences. "You knew my father well. Well enough to know he'd be proud of you standing here." That nearly broke my composure. We sat together near the back before the service began. While politicians delivered polished speeches about General Wilson's patriotism and leadership, Colonel Harris quietly filled in pieces of my father's story. Jonathan Wilson had been respected inside the Corps. Brilliant, stubborn, too honest for his own survival. He believed Marines were supposed to protect people, Harris said softly, even when it cost something. What exactly did he uncover? Harris glanced toward the front where Charles sat beside television cameras. Defense contractors were billing the government for equipment that never reached deployed Marines. I frowned. "You mean theft?" "Yes. And my family covered it up. Some of them." My stomach tightened. "How deep did it go?" "Deep enough that good men got buried." The memorial ended with military honors outside beneath gray skies. A bugler played while cold winds swept across the cemetery lawn. I watched Charles shaking hands with senators and executives while photographers crowded nearby. Not once did he look toward me. That should have made me feel invisible. Instead, strangely, it made me feel dangerous. Later that afternoon, Walter arranged for me to stay temporarily at one of the Wilson family properties in Northern Virginia until legal proceedings began. Calling it a house felt ridiculous. It was an estate. Stone walls, iron gates, a library bigger than my entire duplex back in Oceanside. I wandered through silent hallways filled with military portraits and oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. Generation after generation of men who looked like they believed power belonged naturally to them. I wondered how many secrets lived inside those walls. That evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. "How bad is it?" He asked immediately. "What?" "The news." Apparently, several outlets were already covering the inheritance battle. I sank into a leather chair near the library fireplace. "You ever feel like your entire life was built on lies?" Daniel sighed heavily. "Emily, no, seriously, Mom knew things. She was protecting you. That's becoming everybody's favorite excuse." He went quiet. "Then finally you sound angry." "I am angry." "Who?" I looked around the enormous room. At all of them. That included him too, honestly. Because even Daniel had mocked me before learning the inheritance was real. "You need to be careful," he warned. "Families with this kind of money don't lose quietly." "I'm not afraid of them." "That's exactly why I'm worried." After the call ended, I poured myself a glass of bourbon from the study bar and sat alone for a long time. Around midnight, I found myself wandering into General Wilson's private office. The room smelled faintly of cigars and old paper. One wall displayed military commendations. Another held family photographs. That's where I finally saw it. A framed photo of my father holding me as a baby. I stopped breathing for a second. He looked younger than I expected, smiling, proud. And beside the frame sat another photograph, General Arthur Wilson standing nearby watching us both. My grandfather had known me since infancy. I sat down slowly behind the desk. All those years my mother struggled. All those birthdays without answers. All those nights wondering why my father never loved us enough to stay. And somewhere behind these walls, the truth had existed the entire time. The rage that rose inside me then felt cold, controlled, Marine-trained. Not emotional chaos, purpose. I finally understood something dangerous about revenge. The most powerful revenge isn't screaming. It's patience. And for the first time I started thinking less about surviving this family and more about dismantling them. The hearing began on a rainy Monday morning in Washington, D.C. By then, my face had already appeared on cable news enough times to make strangers stare at me in hotel elevators. The forgotten Wilson granddaughter. The Marine heiress. The woman challenging America's most powerful military family. The media loved neat little headlines. Real life felt uglier than headlines. I stood outside the federal courthouse in my dark blue Marine uniform, while reporters shouted questions from behind barricades. Captain Carter, did General Wilson secretly support you for years? Are you planning to sue the Wilson family? Do you believe your father was murdered? Flashes exploded in my face. Microphones pushed toward me. I ignored all of it and walked inside beside Walter Brenner and my American attorney Linda Carver, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who spoke like every word cost money. You're doing well, she murmured quietly as we entered security. I feel like I'm going to throw up. That means you still understand consequences. Good. Inside the courtroom, Charles Wilson was already seated with 3 attorneys surrounding him like bodyguards. For the first time since meeting him, he actually looked tired, not weak but worn down. The past few weeks had damaged him badly. Financial journalists were investigating the Wilson business empire. Veterans groups were demanding answers about old defense contracts. Political allies suddenly stopped returning calls. The family that once controlled every room now looked defensive everywhere they went. Charles glanced at me as I took my seat. There was hatred in his eyes, but something else too. Fear. The judge entered and the hearing officially began. For hours, lawyers argued over estate law, mental competency, financial transfers, and trust structures complicated enough to make my head ache. I sat quietly most of the morning listening to strangers discuss my life like I was a business transaction. Then Charles's attorney called me to testify. I walked to the witness stand with the same controlled posture I used during Marine inspections. Calm breathing. Steady hands. Never show weakness publicly. Charles's attorney smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile people use before cutting something apart. Captain Carter, he began smoothly. Before last month, you had never met General Wilson personally, correct? Correct. And yet you expect this court to believe he left you the majority of his estate. I didn't ask for it. But you accepted it. I accepted the truth. A few reporters looked up quickly at that. The attorney continued. Isn't it true you were experiencing financial hardship before learning of this inheritance? Yes. So this money would dramatically improve your life. That's generally how $60 million works. A few quiet laughs spread through the courtroom. The attorney's smile tightened. You claim General Wilson admired your military service. I don't claim it. His letters say it. Letters provided by Swiss attorneys. Verified by handwriting experts. He paused annoyed. Then he changed direction. Captain Carter, are you aware your father was investigated for misconduct before his death? Linda Carver immediately stood. Objection. The judge allowed limited questioning. The attorney turned back toward me. Answer the question. Yes, I said calmly. I'm also aware those accusations conveniently protected several defense contractors connected to the Wilson family. The courtroom became very quiet. Charles stared at me with visible anger now. The attorney shifted again. You're suggesting a conspiracy involving respected military and business leaders. I looked directly at him. No, sir. I'm suggesting greed. That landed harder. People understand greed. Even old jurists and polished lawyers understand greed. The questioning continued another 20 minutes before I was finally dismissed. When I stepped down from the stand, I noticed several older veterans seated in the public gallery, watching me differently now. Not as a scandal as a Marine. That mattered to me more than I expected. During lunch recess, I stood alone near a courthouse window drinking terrible coffee while rain streaked across the glass. That's when Daniel appeared. I hadn't seen him since Virginia. "You look exhausted," he said carefully. "You look nervous." "I am nervous." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "I found something." That got my attention immediately. Daniel handed me a worn bundle of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. My stomach tightened the moment I recognized my mother's handwriting. "What is this?" He looked ashamed. "Mom kept them hidden." I slowly untied the ribbon. Letters, dozens of them, all addressed to my mother. All from Jonathan Wilson. My father had written for years. Birthdays, Christmases, updates, promises he'd come home. None of them had ever reached me. I suddenly felt dizzy. Daniel spoke softly. "She was scared, Emily." "Stop saying that." His face tightened. "She thought the Wilson family would take you away. She let me believe he abandoned us." "I know." I looked down at the letters again. 30 years of stolen truth sitting in my hands. I should have felt grief. Instead, what I felt first was rage. Not toward Charles, toward my mother. The realization hurt more deeply than anything else so far. Back inside the courtroom that afternoon, the hearing took a dramatic turn when Colonel Harris testified. The old Marine walked slowly to the witness stand, shoulders still straight despite age. Charles's attorneys clearly underestimated him. That was a mistake. Colonel Harris spoke plainly, calmly, like a man too old to fear powerful people anymore. He described fraudulent military contracts, missing equipment, Marines deployed without proper supplies while executives collected bonuses. Then he said something that changed the entire room. "Captain Jonathan Wilson attempted to report the corruption through official channels," Harris said. "After that, his reputation was destroyed." Charles's attorney objected repeatedly, but the damage was already done. Then Harris looked directly toward Charles. "I watched good Marines bury your family's lies for 30 years. Charles's face drained of color. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw him not as a towering patriarch, but as an aging man cornered by consequences. After court adjourned, reporters exploded into chaos outside. Questions flew everywhere. "Captain Carter, do you believe your uncle belongs in prison? Will criminal charges follow? Is the Wilson empire collapsing?" I didn't answer because honestly something inside me had begun changing during the hearing. Watching Charles sit there pale and exhausted, I suddenly saw the truth more clearly. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was what happens when pride grows stronger than conscience. Charles hadn't looked powerful anymore. He'd looked haunted. And for the first time since Zurich, revenge no longer felt satisfying. It felt heavy. I won the case 3 weeks before Christmas. There was no dramatic applause in the courtroom. No music swelling in the background like old movies, just a judge removing his glasses and saying the words calmly. "The court upholds the validity of General Arthur Wilson's final will and testament." That was it. $60 million, multiple properties, trust accounts, investment holdings. The entire Wilson legacy now legally belonged to me. For a few seconds nobody moved. Then reporters rushed outside to break the news while attorneys shook hands and packed briefcases. Across the courtroom, Charles Wilson remained seated completely still. Not angry, not emotional, just tired, very tired. I stood there in silence realizing something strange. After months of fighting, victory didn't feel the way I imagined. I thought revenge would feel powerful. Instead, mostly I felt sad. Linda Carver squeezed my shoulder lightly. "You did well," she said. "Did I?" She studied me carefully. "That depends on what you wanted." Honestly, I wasn't sure anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded against barricades despite freezing rain. Questions flew at me from every direction. "Captain Carter, are you taking over Wilson Industries? Will you pursue criminal investigations? Do you plan to dismantle the Wilson family empire?" I stopped walking. For the first time since this story began, I answered directly. "My father believed service mattered more than profit," I said calmly. "That's all I'm interested in honoring." Then I left. No speech, no revenge performance, just exhaustion. Back at the Virginia estate, silence filled the enormous house. Most staff had already been dismissed during the legal battle. The place felt less like a mansion now and more like a museum dedicated to loneliness. I wandered through the library where I'd first seen the photograph of my father holding me as a baby. That photo still sat on General Wilson's desk. Picked it up carefully. For 32 years I believed my father abandoned me. Then I believed my family destroyed him. Now, after months buried in legal files and testimony, the truth looked more complicated. My father had tried to expose corruption. Charles and others protected the family empire instead of protecting him. Cowardice ruined everything. But cowardice and murder are not always the same thing. That realization mattered. Late that evening, Walter Brenner entered the library carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon. "You should sleep," he said. "I don't think I can." He handed me a drink. "You resemble your grandfather tonight." "That's not comforting." Walter smiled faintly. "No, it rarely was." We sat quietly beside the fireplace for several minutes. Finally, I asked the question sitting inside me all day. Did General Wilson love my father? Walter answered immediately. "Very much." "Then why didn't he stop any of this?" Walter stared into the fire before speaking. "Because powerful men often confuse control with wisdom." I thought about that carefully. My grandfather spent his life commanding soldiers, influencing politicians and building wealth. Yet in the end he failed at the one thing that mattered most, protecting his own family. The next morning I made a decision that surprised even me. I asked Walter to arrange a private meeting with Charles Wilson. Walter looked genuinely concerned. "Emily, I need to hear it from him." Charles was staying at a private medical residence outside Georgetown after suffering what newspapers politely called exhaustion. The truth was simpler. The man had been crushed by public disgrace. When I entered his room he looked older than he had only weeks earlier, smaller too. Gone was the polished executive from television. This was simply an aging man sitting beside a window watching winter rain. "You came," he said quietly. "Yes." He nodded toward a chair. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally I asked, "Did you kill my father?" Charles closed his eyes. "No." I believed him instantly. Not because he was honorable, because he sounded ashamed. "What happened then?" Charles stared out the window. "Jonathan threatened to expose everything. The contracts." "Yes." His voice had lost all arrogance now. There were senators involved, contractors, military officials, too much money, too many reputations. "And you protected them." "We protected the family." I felt anger rising again. At the cost of his life? Charles swallowed hard. "We thought they would discredit him. Remove him from operations, quiet him." He paused heavily. "We never believed he'd disappear." The room fell silent. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "You abandoned him," I said quietly. Charles nodded once. "Yes." No excuses. No manipulation. Just truth. Then to my surprise the old man started crying. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just silent tears from somebody finally too exhausted to maintain pride. "Your grandfather hated himself for it," he whispered. "He spent 30 years trying to buy forgiveness." That sentence settled deep inside me because it explained everything. The inheritance, the letters, the investigations, the will. None of it was really about money. It was guilt, generational guilt wrapped inside wealth and patriotism. Charles wiped his face slowly. "I know you hate me." I thought carefully before answering. "No," I said honestly. "I think you're weak." That hurt him more than yelling would have. Before leaving, I stopped beside the door. "There's one thing I still don't understand." Charles looked up. "Why leave everything to me?" His tired eyes softened slightly. "Because you became the person this family pretended to be." I drove away from Georgetown through slow evening traffic feeling strangely lighter. Not healed, not peaceful, but clearer. For months revenge had fueled me forward. Now I finally understood something older people probably learn eventually if life gives them enough time. Most revenge ends with sadness because no victory can return the years people stole from you. A week later Daniel came to visit the estate. For once he arrived without expensive confidence or sarcastic jokes. "I owe you an apology," he said immediately. I raised an eyebrow. That's new. I was jealous. Of what? You. He laughed weakly. You spent your whole life actually serving people while I spent mine chasing money. That sounded painfully familiar. We sat together in the library for hours talking honestly for the first time in years. About mom, about family, about how fear quietly poisons people across generations. And that night after Daniel left, I finally made my own decision about the Wilson fortune. Not revenge, not power, something better.